Thank you so much for your patience as we're just letting everyone in from the waiting room. My name is Rhiannon and I'm going to be facilitating this evening. And a real warm welcome to all of you. I'm going to do a brief introduction to why we're here this evening, which I'm sure actually many of you are completely familiar with, before we hand over to our first speaker. I'll introduce the speakers as we go, and we're really honoured to have them all with us. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. This event marks the public launch of the MedAct briefing concerns regarding Palantir technologies in NHS data systems, which covers the risks to the NHS, patients, staff, and human rights of Palantir software. The briefing urges hospitals in England to exercise their autonomy and refuse to implement the software. Despite immense pressure from NHS England, our local NHS institutions can and should resist the rollout of Palantir technology. This is a critical time to do so. The review of Palantir's contract with NHS England is coming up in February 2027, less than a year away, at which point NHS England could pull out of the contract entirely. And we need to put as much political pressure on them to do so. There are multiple reasons why we are all here this evening and many reasons to oppose Palantir's NHS takeover. There is, of course, the ethical frame through which many of us came to this campaign. Palantir, as a company, provide immense political, logistical, and software support to extremely violent operations, such as providing AI weaponry systems used by the Israeli occupation forces in the genocide in Gaza, or to the US military's Project Maven system currently being used for strikes on Iran. Many of us are here in solidarity with communities who face the worst violence of warfare, deportations, genocide, and surveillance, which Palantir has built its software empire enabling. As a company, their operations are totally opposed to the right to health. This is also an issue of worker rights and our autonomy and power as workers. As nurses, doctors, data professionals, and other workers in the NHS, we should not be forced to be complicit in Palantir's operations by using their software. The benefit that Palantir get from the NHS contract is immense, and we outline the many ways they profit from our health system in the briefing. This contract strengthens the entire company. We also can't, as health workers, be forced to use the software when we know the contract is causing huge damage to public trust and ultimately poses a risk to the patients who are already facing the worst health inequalities. If you found out that Palantir, the same company that helps ICE to share addresses from the Department of Health in the US to track and deport people by ICE, was running NHS records, why on earth would you trust your doctor with your data? Then there is, of course, the issue of NHS privatisation and outsourcing. Every UK government knows it is political suicide to officially privatise the NHS. So they allow private companies to make a killing by profiting from huge contracts like this. Key public functions should never be in the hands of private corporations. They should be run transparently in the public interest and by public workers. As data analysts and other skilled technical staff within the NHS know, the push to adopt Palantir software can't be separated from the huge job losses in their areas, replacing skilled NHS workers who could run alternatives to Palantir with outsourced Palantir engineers. Finally, there is the issue of the wider political context in which this contract sits. As we will outline tonight, Palantir's tools enable governments to conduct huge-scale surveillance, tracking, and targeting, in particular of migrants. We should not be under any illusions about the current political context in the UK, with Shabana Mahmood promising that this government will create a panopticon of government surveillance. And we should put this in the context of why they are partnering with Palantir across the NHS, military, police forces, and Cabinet Office. We welcome people who are here for any of the above reasons. We share a common aim and need to build our collective power as workers, patients, and communities to get this contract cancelled. The No Palantir in the NHS campaign is open to all types of people. There are over 20 local groups pressuring their local hospitals to refuse to use the technology, building partnerships in their local communities to hold our NHS institutions accountable. There are doctors, nurses, trade unionists, and community organisers and patients. We also know that not everyone can be part of a public campaign. We know that there is huge internal opposition to this contract within NHS England, within ICBs and within trusts, and we're committed to supporting people who want to whistleblow or resist internally. This is an organized campaign that you can get involved with no matter your relationship to the issue. At the national level, there's a coalition of different civil society groups all pushing for the contract to be scrapped. In order to win and get this contract cancelled, we have to be strategic, connected, and organized. And that is exactly what we are, and where we invite you to join us. We don't see this campaign as a single issue, but as a key strategic target where we can build our collective power and show that as communities and workers, we can resist the expansion of authoritarian tech and data-driven abuses of power. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Juan Sebastian Pinto, described as a critic, an agitator, and an educator by the citizens, is a Colorado-based designer, writer, and organizer, and the Denver lead for Pause AI. His experience crafting AI narratives at Palantir and other startups pushed him to blow the whistle on the harms of autonomous military systems, especially in commercial and civil contexts. Today, he is actively campaigning for the country's first comprehensive AI legislation in Colorado and challenging Palantir, Flock, and data centers on behalf of Denver Against Machines. We're so honored to have you with us, Juan, and I will pass over to you now.
Hey, thanks so much for the introduction and for having me here, and everybody for coming here and being curious about ways in which they can challenge these surveillance systems. I wanted to start just with a quick introduction. So I'm a designer and a writer by trade. I worked for many years in artificial intelligence companies. My job there was to explain how AI and surveillance systems work for different kinds of clients, from the commercial sector all the way to the Pentagon. Some of the tools I helped build and market, especially bring to market, were even used by Anthropic later on, and more recently, a lot of the tools I served to market are, actively being used in war zones, and we're seeing the consequences of their usage at an unprecedented scale. And it's actually tragic to be in a conversation about Palantir's use in the NHS after, the war crimes that they're involved in abroad and in Iran at the moment, especially the massacre of, almost 200 children. But I think what we need to do is understand how we got here, and also why we don't have to be engineers or technical experts to understand how these systems work. We need to take back a lot of language that has been used to describe them. We need to find ways to see the invisible architectures of these systems and scrutinize them, whether we're workers or policymakers or legal professionals. There's a lot of work to catch up on. So my quick conversation and introduction here will serve to help you hopefully be able to look at these systems in a way that is simpler than all the misconceptions that have been pushed by marketing, by all the hype men, basically, that run these companies and control the narrative. I wanted to look at it from a more philosophical point of view, language point of view. I often wondered why I was the loudest voice from internally from Palantir to speak out as an English major, as someone who's not an engineer. And I think it is because fundamentally I was in charge of lying about these systems and finding language and ways to describe them that, eventually I realized did not reflect reality, do not reflect the actual consequences. And I think it's actually up to people who are not engineers and people who are professionals implementing these systems to challenge them continually. A friend asked me the other day, like, what will singularity look like? What will happen when the AI machines take over? And I honestly could not answer the question. And he actually answered the question himself in a way that's smarter than I think anybody. He said, I don't think we'll know how AI will take over the world or the ways in which it will harm us, because it will be so much more advanced than us that we won't be able to understand it. So understanding, educating each other, educating ourselves is the most important thing we can do in order to challenge these systems, in order to understand that we don't have to be experts to understand their harms. So I'm going to start the presentation with that intention, to challenge and reclaim language for us workers, for us healthcare professionals, whoever we may be in this call, and start with this idea that, basically technological progress has moved so fast today, but we've been warned about this. Eisenhower warned about the rise of the military-industrial complex taking over America. Carl Sagan, in this quote, warns, it's from his book, The Demon-Haunted World, about a world in which the information economy takes over our institutions and people are unable to challenge them, understand how they work. So they sort of go into this darkness of of magic, sort of this world of magic, where they don't understand how how decisions are being made, how the world is being shaped around them. And so the idea is, we've seen some major revolutions in the past 20 years or so. One of them being software platforms, these B2B SaaS platforms that are, taking over our information space and the way we do our work every day. And more recently, generative AI, which is, adds so much complexity to the issue of artificial intelligence. So basically, the public understanding is lagging really far behind of these systems and how they work, and the legal and consumer protections that would protect the public are also really lagging behind these developments. Complicating the matters is that everybody who talks about AI, who talks about these data architectures, has a different way to talk about them, often depending on their intentions. So there's technical jargon to describe these systems, there's military ways to describe these systems, marketing, academic ways. I lean on the academic. I think we have made the mistake often of following the lead of the CEOs of these companies and following their narratives too closely and using their language to challenge them. I think what's most important is to find shared language that everybody can understand in order to describe these systems and their consequences. So I'm going to do a little bit of an exercise here, which is in reclaiming language itself. I think Palantir itself as a company has this sort of habit of taking IP and words that aren't theirs and using them for marketing, the main one being their name, Palantir. So I'm going to go into two of those words, the word Palantir and the word ontology, and try to see if we can reclaim them, use them to describe different things than what maybe the marketing is intending us to believe. But let's start with the word Palantir. Many of us in this call probably know by now that it's a loan word from Tolkien, where they describe these all-seeing stones in the Middle Earth, which allow its users to see remote locations, possibly predict the future. But the problem of these stones in Tolkien's work is that they often lead to overconfidence from their users. They often mislead people who make decisions based on knowledge and not on wisdom. So it's a very intentional naming of this company after these stones, because these tools provide sort of that, capability for remote viewing, for predictive analytics, and for making decisions, but in the name itself is the warning already. I think Palantir, today we associate it with the company, but I think the word Palantir, if it was used as a generic term, would actually be extremely well suited to describe all sorts of companies that collect data and give users sort of this surveillance power, this predictive power. And I think that when we think about what Palantir does, we'll see how many companies take a similar architecture and use similar ways of processing data and offer this sort of dangerous possibility of surveillance and prediction that might not be fully grounded in reality. So we're going to talk about sort of these architectures of companies that are like Palantir in the next slide. But what I want you to understand is that these companies like Palantir and companies that process data, form a specific layer on the wider world, where we have multiple companies right now which are coming at different parts of society and looking to replace them with information systems and Silicon Valley companies that are privately owned. So whether we're talking about finance or energy or the cloud layer, sort of Palantir and all the tech companies like Meta that belong there, or space, there are private companies that are pushing their software and their services across the board, across different agencies. And eventually what's happening is what Francesca Bria, a scholar I greatly admire, calls the privatization of sovereignty. So we're losing our sovereignty by delegating our decisions and our actions and our data to these private companies. Specifically, Palantir is at this cloud layer where it kind of coordinates data from different places and helps achieve making decisions. So we're going to look at how Palantir and these cloud companies are structured. Look at what is a Palantir, what is a sort of cloud company, and how does it work, and where are the risks that come up through it. So I'm going to start here with a little diagram that shows basically what Palantir does, but also what many companies in Silicon Valley do. It describes sort of the process of input and output of these systems, But honestly, every platform, every software platform works the same way. What Palantir does differently is it allows its clients to create software applications using this model. So when you're discussing the architecture of these surveillance systems, as someone who is critiquing them, we have to think of it as a sort of pyramid structure. And the most important thing is the data that goes into these systems. And when we look at the data that goes into these systems, we have to consider the bias, the quality of the the quality of the data, the recency, the completeness of the data, legality of the acquisition of the data, the sources, etc. I think when we start our analysis and scrutiny of these surveillance systems, this is the most important part. Tools like Palantir help integrate data and derive decisions from them. So the next layer of these applications is the analytics layer. And this is where a lot of bias, rigidity, selectivity, and discrimination can happen. So it's really important to look at the tools that we're creating sort of these platforms based on the data that we're inputting to them and seeing how they're designed and how they influence decision making at the end. And then finally, if we look at a software platform, it's the final layer is the action layer or the automation layer. And this is, when data and analytics become actions, become tools, become automated sort of decisions. And, the goal of these platforms is to help, automate roles and processes and make decisions. But the most important thing to think about when we're scrutinizing these platforms is who is it affecting, right? The stakeholders, making sure that the outcomes are equitable, are inclusive of different sort of populations, and consider the real outcomes. All software works like this, basically. Most companies sort of try to build a moat around their data and create specific applications that only they can offer their particular industry. But Palantir allows any company to build these tools, to build applications using this sort of structure of combining data, deriving analytics and solutions from that data, and then automating actions and decisions. So I think people, first often don't realize that, most software architecture works like this, but also that they can piece it together even if they don't have, a degree in engineering. And the most important things to consider here are the degree of automation of decisions. As these platforms become more complex, it becomes more and more difficult to trace what actions and decisions are automated or not. Another key consideration is that no matter what solutions are being developed, usually, in everyday civilian contexts, data uses and applications can almost always be weaponized. So all of these sort of tools to extract and use data can be used to exploit data, and can be used sometimes in really creative and strange ways in war scenarios or in law enforcement scenarios. There's the common problem of being overconfident in the results of these tools, and additionally now AI and specifically generative AI is being implemented at all these sort of stages, from the data to the analytics to the actions. And the problem with generative AI, as we have seen, more recently in AI and in its implementation in targeting systems in the military, is that it makes finding the accountability for actions very difficult because, generative AI is prone to hallucinations. It derives sort of its results and output based on its own neural net that is sort of independent from organizational data. So the addition of generative AI to these processes and these data tools just adds a whole layer of complexity. But when we think about these platforms, whether it's Palantir that's being sold at your organization or another, startup, especially from Silicon Valley, that takes this model of promising to integrate your data, offer analytics and actions, we have to realize that, their main incentives are to make money. Their incentives are to sort of do this what they call vertical integration. They want to sell their tools across multiple departments and automate as many processes and actions as possible. They often sell their software sort of in a free way, and then the costs scale exponentially with usage as your organization becomes dependent of these tools. And most importantly to me, it leads to accountability loss because the complexity of these systems really makes investigations and forensics of how actions and decisions came to be. It complicates that, and it allows also most dangerously for institutional bias to be encoded in software architecture. So here's where I'll go to the second word that I want to demystify, and that's ontology. And I think this is important to understand because Palantir talks about it as if it's their intellectual property, this semantic layer that models an organization. But I think what's really important to understand is, this ontology is just a philosophical term. It's a data informatics term. It describes sort of how people make and institutions make sense of reality and the relationships between entities and the reality. Although Palantir's ontology supposedly sits at the analytic layer here in the middle and helps make sense of data. But the problem today is that I really strongly believe this is where a lot of sort of political ideology is injected into these systems. And, first, ontology, the ability to model and simulate systems comes originally from Palantir's ability to detect life patterns of individuals and conduct investigations on social graphs and their relationships. So by first investigating people for intelligence agencies and finding ways of weaponizing their data against them, Palantir was able to start simulating things, started with people and events and their relationships, and then moved on to simulating and creating an ontology out of all sorts of data from all its clients, right? But we have to understand that the roots of this technology are in targeting processes that weaponize people's personal data against them. And we have to, recognize that, these ontologies, the categories that they encode, they can allow, for example, governments to institutionalize bias. And I think the biggest way we're seeing that in the United States today is, Palantir is actively being used by agencies here to police and enact executive orders related to gender ideology and to trans care and to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So using Palantir's tools, these words, these keywords, these things have become sort of a thing to be extinguished out of the United States government. It has led to the massive firing of employees who are working on sort of, gender research or research related to diversity, equity, inclusion. It has led to the cancellation of millions, if not billions, of grants into research of these, important themes. And what really startles someone like me is that the ideas of equity, of inclusion, of underrepresentation, of accounting for the diversity of people and their backgrounds and their race and their gender, it's all so important for the design of a good sort of software platform that accounts for people and for their needs. But Palantir is in itself, kind of like dismantling the idea of these concepts themselves, which are Western concepts of equity, inclusion, of representation. It's being used by the administration to enforce these ideologically based executive orders and then encode them in practice. Fire workers, cancel research grants, and to me that really shows how Palantir's ontology can be reconfigured to really harm people and to reflect the political goals. Another example of how data systems, could be used to discriminate is, Trump made a mandate where there were only two genders now officially in the United States. So any third category, no longer existed at the border, using the information platforms at the border. So a lot of trans people, because their gender or the third gender category was no longer included, had issues crossing at the border. So these ontologies, these definitions of what is what designates what, are made not only through AI classification algorithms, but through people and the designers of these systems. And they allow, bias to be encoded into the architecture of these platforms. So I hope that was a helpful way to understand how these platforms work, the elements around them, and I'm happy to share more. Here's my website. I'll be releasing a lot of these tools in order to, explore these software architectures and challenge them and stay more informed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Juan. And yeah, just to reassure everyone, we'll be sharing out the slides and the recording. So if you want to go back over things, you will definitely have the option to do that. And as we progress through the webinar, we'll be also going on to kind of like actions and organizing. So we'll also come to some of the questions in the chat about the different strategic targeting areas when it comes to the contract in the NHS. So thank you so much, Juan. I'm going to move to our next speaker, Hajira Maryam. She is the lead advisor on artificial intelligence and strategic communications at Amnesty International's Algorithmic Accountability Lab. Her work focuses on strategic communications regarding the human rights impacts of technologies such as artificial intelligence, targeted and mass surveillance, and those enabled by tech corporations. She is committed to researching and raising awareness about how government-deployed technologies can deepen inequalities and discrimination against marginalized groups. Before joining Amnesty, she worked as a journalist focusing on issues related to social justice, gender, and tech. And we're so honored to have you with us this evening. And I will pass over to Hajira.
Thank you so much, Ree, and thank you, Juan, also for an amazing presentation. I mean, just to tell you a bit about myself, I am actually a migrant worker in the UK. I'm from Pakistan. I have a Muslim background, and of course, the context at which all of this is happening, where we are seeing this rise in authoritarian practices across the world, and how that is being enabled by tech corporations, and especially Palantir. It is something that, of course, deeply affects me psychologically and at an emotional scale as well. So that is something as well that I try to maybe also bring out in the work that I do at Amnesty International with my colleagues. And it is an extremely scary environment that we're entering because of these tech giants and behemoths. Now, just to begin with, I'll try to structure my presentation into certain parts. I'll, of course, talk about Palantir, its authoritarian practices, and some examples that we have worked on in Amnesty International. Why at Amnesty International we have called states and corporations and public sector bodies to divest from Palantir. And then at the same time, I would like to close at the power of campaigning and really building on to radical empathy, in calling out these massive tech corporations and type of practices, fascist practices actually, that they do infiltrate in our society. So to begin with, throughout the years, Amnesty International has observed and documented how Palantir Technologies have supplied its technologies and softwares to governments across the world that has posed really high human rights risks in emerging authoritarian contexts. Palantir products like the case management system, the Falcon system, Foundry, Gotham, amongst many other products, provide capabilities to governments to conduct a social sort of restructuring that dehumanizes targets and leads to arrest and also kills marginalized people in hostile conflict situations that, of course, we have seen in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Now, to bring out some examples regarding the work we have done at Amnesty International back in 2020, actually, Amnesty International had raised concerns how Palantir's contracts with the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration Customs Enforcement carried high risk of human rights violations against migrants and asylum seekers in the US in the hands of the authorities. This was specifically done through Palantir's products like the case management system and the Falcon system altogether. Both of these systems actually were used together by ICE to conduct hostile anti-immigrant raids in 2017 and in 2019 in Mississippi. So Palantir works in a very interesting way. I think Juan already outlined that how it sells its product basically for free or even for £1 to the government as a pilot or a test, and then it completely changes the entire architecture and makes the entire system rely only on its own products. So you will basically see a lot of Palantir products working together to kind of enable the hostile environment and human rights violations with their clients. And so basically what happened in the US back then was that thousands of parents and caregivers during these raids of unaccompanied children were arrested, leading to vicious outcomes and human rights violations, such as the right to family unity, the right to liberty, and the lack of prioritization of the rights of the child. And Palantir's products enable these rates, and racial profiling is basically, of course, a key feature of how these systems really operate. And whenever these systems are used, there's, of course, this factor of encoded bias, and migrants are always disproportionately penalized in the hands of these analytic systems, impacting their rights. People ended up in arbitrary detentions, or they kind of get stuck in this entire bureaucratic labyrinth or a maze without any access to remedy or rights due to the lack of procedural fairness. And then last year, basically in mid 2025 at Amnesty International, we published a rapid response research on how Palantir's new immigration OS system used by ICE posed human rights risk of mass surveillance targeting in detention of migrants, asylum seekers, and students who are protesting against the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So basically, this new immigration OS served as an upgrade to the previous case management system, and it automated a deeply problematic and a flawed, unaccountable process that has a history of disregarding the process and human rights of people at large, and then further obscuring and reinforcing problematic human rights violations in the US. And basically, these systems completely lead to a disregard of freedom of expression, freedom of movement. They force a lot of students into silence as well. So there is like a massive mass surveillance type of a panopticon structure that is established because of products by Palantir. Now, moving on, so basically recently as well, we published a briefing called Pull the Plug, and we observed like how Palantir's products were being used in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Basically, that has led to like mass killing and targeting of Palestinians in the Gaza genocide. So of course, like these products are being used in a context of oppression, of apartheid, and for that reason, we have called on states and public institutions to responsibly divest from Palantir. Amnesty International's own policy has actually changed throughout these years because at first we would focus on the business and human rights, the UN guiding principles of business and human rights, and basically call on the state, the private companies to use their leverage when they are dealing with in authoritarian context with governments and completely stop supplying their products to authoritarian governments. But now we are, of course, calling on governments to completely divest from Palantir, and that's what we have been also supporting MidAct in. So basically, when we're talking about campaigning, it is important that we practice radical empathy altogether. And I think that is something at Amnesty International we are really trying to do with MidAct as well. Amnesty International at its core is a massive campaigning organization, and it is important that the type of ideologies that are perpetrated by companies like Palantir of white supremacy and so on and so forth are called out. So yeah, that is from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hajira, for that really important overview of the different human rights violations that Amnesty have outlined and have documented Palantir's involvement in. And I think the alignment of Palantir with kind of fascist and authoritarian state practices is really interesting, right? And they as a company, their founders and CEOs are kind of unusually politically outspoken about seeing a political purpose for their company as kind of, quote, powering the West to its innate superiority through the use of violence. And I think that we kind of as campaigners and as communities we have no doubt about what they know that they stand for and what they proudly stand for, and then at the same time they'll turn around and say, oh, we have the best interests of patients at heart, we just want to support you. Yeah, so with that, we are going to go into a little bit more detail about the context in the UK and the situation with the NHS contract, organising against it, and some of the practicalities around that. And to start with, I'm going to pass on to a comrade from Health Workers for a Free Palestine.
Yeah, thank you, Rhiannon. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about why we shouldn't be fooled by the NHS England PR machine, because they keep just telling us that the FDP is this fantastic thing. And as with all big projects, the law of diminishing returns really comes into play. You know, there's been so much resource that's been put into this project, and there's so much political pressure coming from the top that for many people, the FDP just has to be a success. And the question that we're asking really here is, but at what cost? And as you know, some of the speakers before me and others after me will allude to, is actually enormous. And unfortunately, there are some people who see this project as a kind of stepping stone out of the NHS and onto bigger things with bigger dollar signs. So we have some photos of some people who see it in that way. Some people that have left the NHS to actually go work for Palantir. And yeah, it just goes to show that there's this revolving door of people constantly coming in and out. And actually, in the last 2 weeks, the Financial Times published a story about Matthew Swindles. He was found to be encouraging senior NHS staff to put patient GP data onto the federated data platform. Now, that's in spite of strict governance rules surrounding the sharing of GP data. And this is kind of important because he's the joint chair of 4 North London trusts, including Chelsea and Westminster, which just so happens to be one of Palantir's flagship trusts. And also of note, he works for Global Council and also sits on Palantir's Health Committee. So I'll let you kind of think about the potential conflicts of interest there. And these are just kind of some of the examples about why we should be scrutinising the claims that are being made by NHS England, who's making them, because it's a bit like they're marking their own homework. But if we now kind of delve a little bit deeper into what they're claiming and why it's false. So number one, they keep saying that the federated data platform, or the FDP, I'm going to call it, they say it's this straight out of the box, one size fits all solution to NHS data management. But we know that the reality is that there's no one super software that can magically solve NHS data issues. And we're being promised things that the FDP will do things that it simply isn't doing. So it's essentially a combination of tools that includes apps for local hospitals, things like theatre scheduling, and actually hospitals will already have some kind of version of this in place. And what the FDP does is then it also will suck up data for analysis to be done at the national level. And again, this really isn't anything special. There's lots of different ways that we can do that. So we don't really need the FDP. What we need is investment in data teams, analysts, open source, purpose-built in-house software to improve NHS data systems as a whole. You know, there's no shortage of industry standard tool experts on the job market who could build the tech that we need, including lots of people that already actually work within the NHS. But unfortunately, the black box nature of the FDP, where Palantir control the intellectual property, means that we can't meaningfully control the platform as NHS workers. And actually all the control sits with the Palantir technicians and their unreadable code. And that's why it's really important to situate the Palantir contract alongside Wes Streeting's huge cuts to the ICBs and the plans to kind of completely deconstruct NHS England, because he's deliberately removing the people who can and already run the alternatives to Palantir software. So instead of investing in NHS analysts, they're actually choosing to pay Palantir to set things up. And, you know, they're running apprenticeship schemes in collaboration with Multiverse, who is it's a company run by Tony Blair's son, Ewan. So lots of conflicts to think about there. And another thing that they keep claiming is that the rollout is going great. And they're making huge claims about the benefit that the FDP is bringing to trusts, in some cases claiming that trusts who aren't actually actively using the products are receiving the benefits of it. But thanks to a lot of the research that our campaign's been doing, we've been doing loads of freedom of information requests, and we know that actually many trusts aren't using it and they don't want to. And let's kind of consider some of the quotes that we've had from analysts and NHS digital workers that we've spoken to that we've included in our briefing. So one of them said, "We're being forced to use a convoluted system that makes even the simplest tasks feel like pulling teeth. It's demoralizing, and honestly, it's a waste of everyone's time and public money." Another one said, "Not only could similar functionality have been delivered at a fraction of the cost, but the existing tools are already better integrated, more intuitive, and more conducive to collaboration." So as an example, in Manchester, we have our own analytics and data science platform. And the business case for the FTP was actually built around that. It was used as kind of the basis for it. And in deciding to pause the plans for rolling out the FTP in Manchester, the Greater Manchester Integrated Care Board said that their use of data and insight is leading to action that genuinely saves lives and that they didn't need the FTP. And, you know, it's not like all trusts exist as part of some kind of competitive research consortium in this country. We have a National Health Service, and these kinds of tools and data infrastructure could and should be shared throughout the NHS. And, you know, the Greater Manchester Integrated Care Board, they're not a lone wolf here really either. So Leeds Teaching Hospital declined adoption in 2024. They said that they'd lose functionality rather than gain it. And there's several other trusts across the country, including in Warwickshire, Essex, and London, who have all refused to use the FTP because they were already implementing a new digital system. So some trusts and ICBs might have also agreed to get the infrastructure put in place. But again, that doesn't mean that they're using it. But NHS England are still kind of including them in their numbers. So in December, we found that only 16 out of 130 trusts were using the full suite of products. And many reported partial, constrained, or unstable usage. And we know that the core modules the core apps that they're kind of selling us, they're only being used by between 20 to 50% of those trusts at best. That is not evidence of success. So we've got this situation where most providers are kind of stuck in this halfway house. They've been forced to adopt this thing, expected to deliver benefits, but actually they've been given tools that they're not stabilized, they're not interoperable, and they're not aligned to real workflows. And something that's actually been pretty telling as well about the rollout is that NHS England is procuring contracts for research into the perceived benefits to better understand the needs of trusts. So essentially, they're insisting on rollout timetables that bear no relationship to readiness, stability, or user need. And then another claim that they love to make is that they take data protection seriously. Now, in the briefing, we outline multiple data protection issues that NHS England continue to dismiss and they don't address. Duncan is going to talk a little bit more about that shortly, but from our point of view, the analytics that you can do is only as good as the quality of the data that you put in. And when you hear about the data protection issues, you know that Palantir is a supplier. There's going to be staff who quite rightly don't want to put their patients' data into the FTP, and we fully support them in this because we know that this contract isn't just about the NHS. It's situated as part of the broader push in the UK to expand policing and surveillance powers. And Palantir can claim, you know, that there's no data sharing beyond the FTP, but we need to bear in mind that it is actually possible to drag and drop data between Palantir's health and military systems. And we need to assess the risk of cross-government data sharing in the future. So alarm bells should have been ringing last year, because in Parliament, Lewis Mosley, who's the CEO of Palantir UK, he formally recommended to run the government on a single operating system that combines national government, health data, and much more. And unsurprisingly, he gave Palantir as an example of a company that could do that for them. Now, the alarm bell should be ringing even louder still now, because Reform have openly stated their intention to create an ICE-style deportation agency. A 2025 policy document they put out, it was called Operation Restoring Justice, promised an uncompromising legal reset, adding that a reform government will relentlessly identify and detain all illegal migrants in the UK. Using powers granted by the new legislation, it will automatically share data between the Home Office, NHS, HMRC, DVLA, banks, and the police. And we know from their work in the US that Palantir would have zero reservations about agreeing to do this for them. And this is what we mean in the briefing when we say that Palantir is not a dutiful data processor. And in their legal right of reply to the briefing, they simply emphasize that it does what the government or the data controller asks it to. And when we consider that Alex Karp, CEO of Palantir, said in 2023 that the data in the FDP belongs to the UK government, we have to say no, it doesn't. It belongs to patients. And just to finish up my section, I want to say that we're really not anti-tech. We all want to have better and more efficient data systems. But the cost-benefit analysis in this iteration of the FDP, it's not looking good. We're in touch with lots of different NHS England staff who are seriously concerned about the ethics, quality, and privacy of the data. And if you're watching this and you feel similarly, we would really love to hear from you. Like, you're definitely not alone in this. And we're supporting lots of NHS and ITB data workers to organise in their workplace. And in particular, I really want to highlight the NHS Analysts Together network. They comprise both analysts and NHS England workers. They have a Substack and a LinkedIn that we're going to share, hopefully in the chat and also with you afterwards. And they're going to be launching an open letter in the next few weeks, collecting signatories from NHS data professionals. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But that's it. That's it for my section. And if we now just hand over, I'm going to pass over to Wayne.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, really helpful debunking of some of NHS England's top lines. I'm going to pass over to Wayne Farah. Wayne has over 20 years experience as an NHS non-executive director, focused on improving healthcare for disadvantaged communities. He was previously the facilitator of the National Black and Minority Ethnic Leadership Network at NHS Confed before he resigned, as he refused to be complicit in the health washing of Palantir's reputation and compromise on his principles and commitment to equality. He has over 30 years experience as a social entrepreneur and community organizer. He is a long-term associate of the Institute of Race Relations, former chair of Anviat Housing Association, and a trustee of the Newham Monitoring Project and Doctors of the World UK. He was a founding member of ADCRIS CIC, Umoja Theatre Company, Vision Care for Homeless People, the Migrants' Right Networks, and the ARHAG Housing Association. And it's such a pleasure to have you with us, Wayne, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thanks, Anna. I've obviously been a very busy old boy, haven't I? But yeah, I stood down last year as chair of the BME Leadership Network rather than share a platform with Palantir at Expo. Simple as that. I could have done that quietly and I could have stayed in my job, but I also chose to work with Byline Times to get the concerns raised out into the public. And I did that knowing I would lose my job. And, you know, that's not easy. We've all got bills to pay. But I've never thought about anti-racism as being a career choice. But what I did know is the NHS, like any bureaucracy really, they rely upon people acting like functionaries and following orders from their superiors, right? And believing that anyone in their position would do the same thing and understanding their role as doing what they're told to do. And I class this as the Eichmann defense, okay? So you say, oh, I didn't do anything wrong, you know. And it kind of comes from the notorious Nazi war criminal who, when he was tried in 1961, he tried to evade responsibility. His defense was, I wasn't really involved in the Holocaust because I was morally neutral. I never hated the Jews, or by appealing, I was just part of the hierarchy. The people above me told me what to do, or just the simple ethics of just doing my job. And what I want you to understand is, though he was a senior Nazi and he was one of the people who made the Holocaust happen, he wasn't a monstrous sadist. He was just an ordinary bureaucrat whose inability or refusal to think ethically about his actions enabled extraordinary evil to happen. This is what Hannah Arendt defined as the banality of evil. She reframed his defense as a warning about the dangers of obedience, a critique of bureaucratic systems that diffuse responsibility, and a challenge to the simple idea that evil is something committed only by fanatics. And I would say that as a reminder that obedience does not absolve us of responsibility, especially when systems cause harm. And therefore, I think that must be at the center of any debate about data-driven surveillance, algorithmic decision-making, corporate complicity in human rights abuses, and public services enforcing unjust policies. And in my 20 years in the NHS, and I was there because I believe in universal healthcare. But I watched the public service built on solidarity, designed to provide care free at the point of need to everyone, regardless of wealth or status, was reshaped by privatization into a market-driven public health system. A system where the most vulnerable, including racialized and migrant communities, suffer first. And we saw this in the Windrush scandal, when NHS data was shared with the Home Office and we become entangled in the machinery of the hostile environment. And in that, we were complicit in detaining British citizens, denying them care, and in some cases, leaving them to die. All of us NHS leaders, doctors, nurses, we allowed that to happen, and we continue to enable it to happen. No one needed to make a decision to let people die. They just did what they were told. They processed the forms, and like everybody else was doing. But what I learned was it doesn't end with just the vulnerable. Because once you accept the false premise that public resources are inherently scarce and must be rationed and marketized and made efficient, you accept that public services should be organized around cost minimization and not human need. Everything else follows. The immigration control, the cuts, the outsourcing, the lean staffing. And we've seen what the outcome of that is in Mid Staffordshire, Shropshire and Telford, Morecambe Bay, East Kent. Tragedies all driven by systems where hitting financial targets and performance metrics mattered more than patients. Systems where understaffing, corner cutting, and managerial denial were routine, and therefore the banality of evil triumphant. Privatisation has been bad for the NHS and for any of us who can't afford Bupa. But Palantir is not simply another private contractor. Contracting the private sector to do things is one thing, but handing them control of the whole infrastructure that governs the system is another level of stupid. Palantir, to me, are the Trojan horse for the next stage of NHS privatisation. Technology is never neutral. It reflects the values and the power structures of those who build it. And so Palantir is a threat to the NHS because its ideology is fundamentally at odds with the democratic values of a national health service. Peter Thiel has publicly questioned whether freedom and democracy are even compatible. And his politics matter because in data infrastructure systems that classify populations, measure risk, and predict behavior, ideology is what defines the data. Data fuels the predictions, and the predictions drive the practice. And that's how structural racism is built into systems like Palantir's. And that's why anti-racism is not about equality statements or diversity training. It's about examining the systems we build, the institutions we legitimize, and the infrastructures we allow to govern public life. That's why I felt the need to speak out against Palantir. Because when critical national infrastructure is controlled by private corporations, it is vulnerable to political pressure beyond democratic control. And we saw that when officials of the International Criminal Court suddenly lost access to email and financial services because of sanctions pressure from Thiel's friend Donald J. Trump. The Swiss Armed Forces recently concluded that sovereignty and data control risks associated with Palantir were too great because US intelligence agencies could access their sensitive military data. The NHS has one of the most comprehensive and valuable data sets in the world for healthcare. It employs world-class clinicians, statisticians, public health researchers, and data scientists. And as we've heard earlier, Manchester already said they've got a better system than Palantir. So we need to focus, I think, the challenge to NHS leaders, not just to explain why we need Palantir, but why they want to hand over power to a company whose data analysis and surveillance tools naturalize racial profiling and support human rights abuses. Why do they want a high surveillance, low accountability data infrastructure that further undermines their ability to deliver equal outcomes and access to marginalized communities? Why do they want to spend millions of pounds that could be invested in frontline services on a non-NHS system when a better NHS system already exists? And I think in management theory terms, I think it's what we call the Aberline paradox. And explains how group makes bad decisions because individuals prioritize harmony over integrity. Each leader within it thinks the other leaders support the idea, so they should keep quiet to keep the peace. But what appears to be a consensus of a support for the policy hides the fact that nobody actually supports it. As a result, everybody gets what nobody wanted, all because no one told the emperor that he had no clothes. And that's why I think we must challenge integrated care boards and trusts in their public board meetings to justify their collaboration, especially in light of knowing there's already an NHS system available. Executives may want to stay silent because their career depends upon a health secretary who is always open to sweetening the deal for private sector healthcare. So I think we should explicitly target the non-executives, because those are the people who are supposed to represent the public interest and to uphold the principles of integrity, accountability, and openness. Let's just demand they do their bloody jobs and hold the executives to account if they haven't already reached out to Manchester to get a share of the better system. But I don't think we should just simply challenge them on the Palantir contract. I think we need to draw them into a wider debate about what kind of digital infrastructure should shape the NHS for future generations. A public infrastructure or a corporate infrastructure? An infrastructure based in care or based in surveillance? An infrastructure that promotes equality or reproduces inequality? The NHS, after all, is a collective promise, a promise that care will be given according to need, that every life has equal value, that the system exists for the public good. Replacing public governance infrastructure with corporate surveillance infrastructure will be a breach of that promise. Because the NHS belongs to us, to all of us, not to the politicians, not to corporate profiteers, and not to Palantir. Like Bevan once said, the NHS would endure for as long as there were folks who had the faith to fight for it. So let's defend it, let's protect it, and let's be the folks who are always there to defend it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Yeah, for a really, really powerful and important talk. Yeah, it's so great to have you with us this evening. We're gonna move on to our final speaker, and then we'll go into a little bit of kind of next steps and kind of talking about pressure points where you can use the briefing, use the campaign, and target different pressure points that exist within the contract. So we'll go into a bit more detail about that. But first, I'll hand over to Duncan. So Duncan McCann is the head of technology and data at the Good Law Project, where he is responsible for managing legal campaigns against Reform, X, and Palantir. Duncan has a long-standing interest in how to ensure that big tech is held accountable, and previously worked at Five Rights and the New Economics Foundation. And I'll pass over to you, Duncan.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Appreciate that everyone has been hearing a lot of information in the last hour. I'm just going to try, maybe for the next 5 minutes or so, because I want to leave some time for questions, just try and clear up some of the kind of questions that have been both raising in the chat and some of the issues that we know that people hear about a lot when you're talking about this with people on the doorsteps. Maybe firstly, I'll address, only because I've seen it in the chat, so many times, about this whole what can we opt out for and how does your opt out work? So here there's a lot of kind of different regimes kind of falling on top of each other. Let me start with the legal side of things. So as an individual, as a data subject, you do have rights over your data, but rarely are those rights absolute. So just because I say no doesn't necessarily mean that no, the other party, the party holding your data, can't use your data. So this idea that we have full control over our data, especially in the medical context, is one that we just need to forget about. The NHS takes an absolute right to use your data for what they call your primary care. So when it is delivering care to you, you cannot opt out of your data being used for that purpose. Where you can opt out, and indeed this is the kind of what we've been seeing in the chat, is around some of your data and how it's used for both research and planning. Those are considered what's called kind of secondary uses of the data. And so we have, in theory, legally, some rights over those. Those rights are enshrined in things like the General Data Protection Act and things like that. Now, what's challenging is that the NHS didn't decide when the General Data Protection Act came into force to kind of implement an opt-out. They have this thing which is called the National Data Opt-out or the GP Data Opt-out, which kind of sounds like it's doing the same thing, but actually, if you ask NHS, this thing was never intended to meet the legal obligations of the law. It is in theory intended for what NHS do, to give you some empowerment, but exactly what happens when you opt out is very, very hard to identify. And indeed, NHS, all the various data sharing agreements are almost done kind of ad hoc. And so it can be very hard to understand exactly what you can opt out for. But the one thing I can confirm, I know it's been said in the chat a few times, it is impossible currently at the moment to opt out of your data being used for Palantir generally, because Palantir, unfortunately, is very much going to be processing that data for your primary care, for your actually use. And so now, as if that wasn't all complicated enough, Wes is also so unhappy with the way that the current system is, and it is in process of being, the policy is in process of being changed. Now, not to reflect better rights for us as patients over our data, but indeed to give the centralized powers more authority to just use data. And we've seen a very worrying example of this crop up just in the last few weeks. When COVID hit, for the basis of emergency planning and pandemic response, a full set of our GP records were taken. At this point, we were promised categorically that this was only going to be used for the purpose of pandemic planning and the COVID response. A few weeks ago, the Department of Health has decided to U-turn on that and will absolutely be repurposing that data. So again, these promises and these assurances that we have that our data is only going to be used for this purpose is sadly not something that we can take to the bank. So the opt-out is complicated. There is a petition going around for a more pervasive opt-out. Good Law Project has been doing a lot of work to try and hold the NHS to the legal requirements of the opt-out, but sadly it is the thing that NHS and Wes are trying to kind of weasel out of. A second question that I know I get a lot and other people get a lot is this thing all really secure? What access does Palantir really have to this data? Aren't they just processing it? And it's all just, I think as we heard previously. I think here again, revelations that we've had just over the weekend about how Palantir has access to our defense data, potentially more sensitive, at least from a national security perspective, than our health data. And what it turns out from whistleblowers from within the Ministry of Department is that even though Palantir aren't taking exact copies of our defense data or taking unauthorized copies of classified information, they can, from the unclassified information that they process and the data that they infer and create from processing that data, they can actually find out sensitive and classified information. Indeed, the article and the whistleblowers allege things like the location of our nuclear submarines. Now, if they can do that from the defense data, imagine what they can do from our health data, where they have very much the same kind of access as they would to our defense data. They are processing it. They're not supposed to be taking a copy, but absolutely they can generate their own insights and their own learnings. And this is maybe another really important point, is that sure, Palantir may not benefit by getting my, Duncan McCann's health record specifically, but they are absolutely learning how to build and improve that product. And you can absolutely be sure that as they build and improve that product, they are rolling that built and improved product out to all of their customers. And so absolutely, their engagement with the NHS, the money that the NHS is plowing in, and the learnings they are getting on the ground is absolutely not only benefiting Palantir, but also benefiting the other customers who use Foundry and the other operating systems, and of which many are the human rights violators that we've heard about previously. I'm maybe just going to finish, and I know because I really want to get some questions, just to talk about my local experience as well. So as well as being a kind of national campaigner kind of person, I'm also just an ordinary person who lives in Hackney. My local hospital, Homerton, is one of those who is thinking about whether to join or sign up to the NHS Trust. And I am so lucky to be part of an amazing, vibrant campaign that takes in that has both a really vibrant community, and we are absolutely not only taking this to the Health Trust and the decision that they have to make, but we are, they are, and I'm only playing a small part of it, but the campaign is really making this an important local issue in our elections, which are coming up soon. And I think it's so powerful, again, that the Greens have taken this really powerful stance of being anti-Palantir, so that we can really force, in a place like Hackney, which is a kind of Labour safe seat, to Labour to also take notice that they cannot just get into bed with companies like Palantir and expect us all to just shrug our shoulders and walk off. And I would just urge you to really think about joining your local campaigns. They are absolutely amazing, vibrant places. And the more people who hear about Palantir, the more people who are turned off by it. The one thing that Palantir needs is secrecy and lack of transparency. As soon as we talk about Palantir, as soon as we make people understand who Palantir are and what they are offering, that is when we empower them to kind of say no, and that's how we can start to build this this campaign. So so thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Duncan. And I think, a really important point to end on from the speakers. And I'm going to jump straight into the kind of question that keeps coming up the most in the chat, which is, where are the points of pressure, strategic pressure, that we can utilize to get this contract cancelled? So what I'll do is I'll kind of maybe ask each speaker to speak a little bit to their reflections on different points of pressure in this context. But I think the key thing to take away is that these companies and the UK state in general really benefits from a sense of powerlessness, from a sense of, all these tech companies, they're too big, or the state is too big, the Home Office is too big for us to kind of mount any meaningful resistance. And I think what we have seen from organising this campaign over 2.5 years is that couldn't be further from the truth. The organised power of both people resisting in their communities, people resisting in their workplaces, is putting huge amounts of pressure on this contract, on NHS England and on the UK government. And that's kind of exactly what they really don't want us to continue doing. So we should all commit to continue doing that. So there are a real kind of multitude of tactics that you can employ, whether you're thinking about doing that in your workplace or your community. And in particular, the pressure point that is really important at the moment is local hospitals. So as people have kind of touched on, the technology and the software that Palantir is rolling out relies on basically every hospital, every ICB, not only adopting it, but also actively using it. And if they don't use that, the software is basically defunct. There are like some uses of it at the national level, but it would be like slightly ridiculous it would be totally ridiculous to continue the contract if the majority of hospitals, as they are currently, continue to not really use it, which is why you see NHS England hiring consultants like KPMG to promote the adoption of the FDP. So the hinge of local hospitals and the fact that they are meant to be accountable to their local communities, not to American tech corporations, is a really important area of pressure. So there are over 20 different local groups in the country who are currently organising in their local area to hold their hospitals accountable. And after this webinar, we'll be sending out a list of where they are and a form to coordinate getting you in touch with your local group. Or if your local group doesn't exist, supporting you to set one up. And in this work, there are lots of tools available to help you in your organising. You don't have to start from scratch. This campaign has been going for years now, and there's different resources available. So, for example, the Good Law Project tool allows you to put in your postcode and write a formal complaint to your local hospital. So you could, for example, flyer in your local area, encouraging people to submit complaints, and then request a board meeting with request a meeting with representatives from your local hospital to discuss this. There is the policy from the British Medical Association, the Doctors Union, which kind of gives us the mandate to organise within that union, and you can take the policy to your local union branch and bring it to your local negotiating committee. So that is whether you're in the Doctors Union, BMA, or whether you're in other health unions such as Unite and Unison, or whether you're in tech workers unions like United Tech and Allied Workers unions. We have model union motions, and you can go into meetings with the backing of your union branch, and we can even help, sending kind of experts to help speak at your local union branches. We have built a website with the most up-to-date freedom of information requests, so you don't have to go and FOI your local hospital, find out what's happening before you start organising. Again, we'll send this all out after the webinar, but we've built a website which updates with freedom of information requests that tells you, what is your hospital doing? Has it said it's going to use Palantir tech? And if it said yes, what has it said it will use? Right. So if it says it's going to use the mental health first response tool, then that we should be trying to speak to mental health workers, to mental health patients, and to think about, or if it's saying that they're going to use the theatre scheduling app, who's organising the surgeons in that hospital, or if they've said at all that they're going to use it, building accountability and organising with community groups that are working on anti-racism, migrant rights, anti-imperialist groups, building those local coalitions, all of whom have a stake in getting this contract cancelled. There are so many local democratic mechanisms that people have had success targeting with. So the local council, for example, most people, I didn't know this before this campaign, local councillors have the power to summon hospital leaders to their meetings with something called a health scrutiny committee, where you can present, you can ask questions, and your local councillors can summon hospital leaders to come and speak and answer questions. The hospital trusts often have open meetings where patients and staff can go and raise questions. You can share the briefing document that we've published with your MP, asking them to raise questions about the contract in Parliament. And if you need any assistance or guidance, we're always kind of ready and on hand to help you with ideas and support you in your organising. And we'll be sending out all of the links, contact emails, everything after the webinar. People all over the country have been organizing in their workplaces and communities, whether that's Palestine solidarity groups, migrant justice groups, or other community networks. We are really building this campaign and this power and this kind of collective power that we need to be able to assert kind of our collective power as workers and as communities to get this contract cancelled. And I will stop there and kind of hand over to the other speakers to kind of share their reflections on points of pressure and then come back to any other questions. Yeah, maybe Hajira, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Amnesty International is also going to have their own campaign on Palantir ahead of the review of the NHS. So I would definitely outline that, like supporting our campaign. It's going to be out soon. As well, I think one thing I really also just like think about and try to encourage is I think in terms of Palantir, it's very interesting how they are already known as like the bad vicious cop in the media space. Right. So, thinking about also like using media narratives in our favor, reaching out to journalists, outreach or anything like that. I think that can also probably work in terms of like campaigning and building a wider narrative across the UK and England, calling out divestment from Palantir. Yeah. I'll give it to Duncan maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well as, I think the main ones from us is, contact your trust, get involved in your local campaign. I think, again, the trusts are unused to hear it. Over 55,000 people have used our tool to contact their local trusts. That is a volume of communication to chief executives that they're just not used to. So I think it is really interesting. The other thing to remember about Palantir is that people are campaigning this from so many different aspects. So we are on the ground fighting this in the trenches. But, people are also, the financial markets are also attacking Palantir. So one thing that's really interesting that people might not be aware, so Michael Burry, who wrote The Big Short, who predicted the housing market crash, he has a massive short position on Palantir, which means he is betting that the price will go down. And you bet he is lobbying all of his venture capital friends, all of the money in America, because Palantir is way overvalued, even for an AI stock. And we are very likely to be going through an AI correction. So, and the thing to remember is that these two stories play in together, because it was partly Michael seeing the regulatory challenges that Palantir was under, especially in the UK, by organizations like us fighting an on-the-ground battle to keep them out of these contracts, that made him realize that actually this stock is really at risk. So again, this edifice of like unbeatable, this is like a foregone conclusion. It's a pack of cards. It's a house of cards. And if we manage to topple one of those, the whole edifice falls down. And so that's why, again, this next 11, 12 months are so important, because this is a fight that we can win. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to add to that point as well. In the risk assessment that they did at the start of the contract, one of the main risks that they highlighted was opposition from activists who were concerned with all the issues around it. So they've known that this could be something that they were going to fall down with at the beginning. So I think that's a really important point to make.
Thanks. Wayne, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I don't know. I recently caught up with a YouTube site called Barry's Economics. And that's not Gary's Economics, of Gary Stevenson, who is the millionaire who's campaigning for higher taxes. He's a comedian who's built a community comedy club. But he's actually given some really interesting summaries of some of the data around how getting involved in community campaigns against injustice, which is what we're talking about, is actually good for your mental health. It's good for your self-esteem, and it's good for you. So it's worth having a look at, because I think we often forget that they rely upon not only secrecy but also keeping us atomized, keeping us as individuals. Yeah, so that as long as you're an individual, I can make a protest, I can not share a platform. But if you're just an individual, right, you don't realize how close we are to delivering change, because you only see the small group of people you're interacting with, and I've taken a lot of strength from this evening by just seeing the hundreds of people who've turned up. And so I think pat ourselves on the back but know that not challenging injustice is a good way of staying healthy.
Thank you so much, Juan. Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think, yeah, really these companies and the states thrive off us being disconnected from each other, because as individuals, our capacity to resist these companies and the state violence is so much less than together. I'm going to come to two kind of specific questions in the chat about pressure points. So one was a question about people who are working in academia or healthcare charity sectors or healthcare regulatory sectors, and what kind of roles that they can play. So obviously NHS England kind of thrives off this idea that it's consulting with lots of different groups, right? In terms of, the FDP and Palantir's involvement, and we've got all these people who support us and we're listening to. And so targeting like your contacts with NHS England is going to be really important, but also targeting the kind of social license of both NHS England and Palantir. So I think something that's really important and interesting to note is that Palantir have really invested in the healthcare charity and think tank sector in the UK. So they partner with the Patients Association, which is the representative body for patients in the UK. So Palantir are one of the Patients Association's corporate partners, and Palantir are also one of the platinum sponsors of the King's Fund, which is one of the UK's most influential health policy think tanks. So I think if you are in kind of health think tank or health kind of charity sector areas, kind of tackling and Palantir are also the sponsors of the upcoming Women in Data conference, after kind of proudly declaring that the AI was going to reduce the power of educated women. So tackling the social license and the kind of soft influence that Palantir has tried to build in the UK health sector, I think is really important. And then there's the issue of, should we be targeting NHS England or Wes Streeting, and kind of how in bed are the politicians with Palantir, especially with the Mandelson scandal. I think there are these kind of different points of pressure, which does include Wes Streeting and NHS England at the national level, as well as the local. Ultimately, Wes Streeting is at risk of losing his seat. And I think like local organising that emphasises his role, his relationship to Palantir, which is increasingly close, is also a good suggestion. Whoever put that suggestion in the chat. But yeah, the answer to all of these different areas is all of these different areas require us to organise collectively. And I think most of the other questions in the chat, a lot of them were answered, especially in your bit, Duncan. So thank you so much for that. And just to say that we will email out everything that has been shared. So, slides, key information, speakers, ways to get involved, ways to contact us. And what we really want people to take away from today is that you have power and agency to get this contract scrapped, and that this is like a critical time window, both to stop local hospitals from adopting the software, but also to force NHS England to cancel it. So the actual end date for the contract is February 2027, at which point NHS England has to choose to extend it. And this kind of natural break clause is we can make this year absolute hell for NHS England and force them to cancel the contract. And that's kind of the aim of what we'll be doing for the next year. And we would love everyone to be involved in that. So I think we'll close out there. It's been information heavy evening, and we've got the chat as well. So if there's if there's kind of really important questions that we haven't managed to cover, we can also send out written written responses to any of the questions that are easier to respond to over email. And I'll just hand over to anyone who has any kind of closing remarks.
I'll come in. Thanks so much for being a really great host. I really just wanted to conclude with why we think this fight is just so important. this campaign was kind of started in response to the call from Palestinian trade unions to tackle complicity within our workplaces. And like you mentioned, it might feel like taking on this contract is a bit of a tall order, but we recognise that as workers and communities, we really have agency and power to resist these kinds of companies, as long as we get organised and we're really strategic in that opposition. And I hope that one of the main things that you can all take away from today is that actually this isn't a single issue campaign. It's not just about the NHS. This is about our community's experience with state and corporate violence. And this one contract is a strategic target so that we can weaken Palantir's plans to expand into the UK and show this government, which continually seeks to increase repression, surveillance, and border violence, that the public won't comply. And that's why we're really, really keen to work in collaboration with groups that are tackling these same issues, because we all want the same thing. And we're not naive anymore to think that the institutions that we work in, even in something like the NHS, which we all try to hold as dearly as we can, we're not naive enough to think that they can't propagate harm at home or further imperialist and colonial endeavours abroad. So yeah, ultimately we have to demand accountability from those making decisions, and also from ourselves, to create the kind of future that we want to see. And so, yeah, I really want to just, again, emphasize what Wayne said about how much doing stuff like this can improve your own mental health. It's a fantastic campaign to be a part of. It's such a supportive group of people all working towards something that's really important. So really just would encourage everyone to get involved. And so, yeah, hopefully you'll see the form coming from us soon if you want to get more involved in the campaign. We can signpost you to everywhere that you need to be. But thanks so much for coming tonight. Really, really appreciate everyone taking the time.